Well, good morning again. My name's Adrian Bertrand from Six Capitals Advisory, representing this UK PACT project team. Thanks again for your patience this morning. Apologies, these technical difficulties were out of our control. And thanks very much for being willing to meet on this MS Teams platform. As mentioned earlier, we are running a repeat session of today's webinar on Wednesday this week. So that Wednesday, the 25th of August, from midday, 12 o'clock until 2 o'clock. If you'd prefer to join us for that session, you're most welcome. But we will be continuing with the webinar as planned. And it's a great pleasure on behalf of the project team to welcome you to today's webinar. Just a reminder to please ask any questions that you may have or to make any comments that you wish to make in the chat function. And our speakers will endeavour to answer your questions as we proceed through the content of the webinar. But we will also have a time for Q&A towards the end of the webinar. And we really do encourage questions and comments because we can learn from one another in terms of this emerging topic. Also, just to mention that we are recording the webinar. We will be sharing the webinar recordings via the DNA hosted project website. I checked in with DNA this morning. For those of you who have attended some of our earlier webinars, the content has been provided to the website service provider, and we're confident that the content should be live by the end of today. That would be for all prior webinars in the series. And we need a few days to load today's webinar. Again, let me speak to the agenda for today. So we'll try and keep the welcome and introductions fairly short and sweet. I'll also try, when introducing the project, to try and keep that fairly brief, on the understanding that many of you are probably not joining us for the first time. But will have hopefully joined us for the first and second theme webinars in the series. And today is the first in webinar 3 of the 4 webinars available on different climate and investment and disclosure related themes. So as part of the welcome and introductions, I'm delighted to introduce probably not a new face to many of you, but certainly it'll be the first time that Corley Leroux joins us as a co-presenter for this specific UK PACT funded series of webinars. Corley is a certified director of the Institute of Directors of Southern Africa. She's also an independent ESG consultant, and we're also delighted to call her an associate of Six Capitals Advisory. Corley contributes to and supports Six Capital's client projects and deliverables as needed. Previously, Corley has served as head of sustainability at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and Corley is currently a member of the Global Reporting Initiative's Global Sustainability Standards Board, or GSSB, which oversees the development of the GRI sustainability reporting standards. Corley also serves on the Integrated Reporting Committee of South Africa's Working Group, which develops guidance on integrated reporting for reporting organizations in South Africa. Corley is also and has been for a number of years part of the judging panel for the Chartered Governance Institute of South Africa's annual Integrated Reporting Awards, and she's served in this role since 2018. Corley also serves as a member of the King 4 Subcommittee on Climate Change and is also serving on the Land Bank's External Monitoring and Evaluation Peer Review Panel. Lastly, Corley is supporting the CRISA Secretariat as project coordinator for the review of the CRISA Code, or the Code for Responsible Investment in South Africa. And Corley has also previously served as chair of the World Federation of Exchanges Sustainability Working Group. Corley, it's lovely to have you with us today, and we look forward to you sharing with us today alongside Melanie Smith. Many of you will have already met Melanie during our previous webinars. Melanie is a colleague of mine at Six Capitals Advisory. Melanie serves as the practice head for our research and reporting practice area, and Melanie and Corley work on a number of client projects together. In this role, Melanie heads up our ESG and reporting capability in supporting Six Capital's clients, such as this specific UK PACT funded project, which we've undertaken in partnership with our consortium partners. Melanie, for example, led on the climate risk fact sheets for more than 50 JSE listed companies, which is one of the deliverables of this project. And Melanie also was in charge of our research project for the research commissioned by WWF and funded by Sanlam into the state of TCFD reporting in South Africa, which included extensive engagements with a number of leading corporate reporters, as well as industry associations and investors. Lastly, Melanie has recently completed her Master's in Sustainability at the Sustainability Institute of the University of Stellenbosch. And so it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Melanie and Corley as our presenters and facilitators for today's webinar. It would, however, be remiss of us not to thank and provide further information about the UK PACT, which is the UK government DFI funding this particular South Africa-UK PACT series of projects, of which this specific project features as one of the portfolio projects within the South Africa-UK PACT portfolio of projects. So very briefly, UK PACT stands for Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions. This is a £60 million program which has been running since 2018 and is expected to run until 2022. The mission and vision for UK PACT is that it is part of the UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy through the UK's International Climate Finance portfolio. UK PACT is all about supporting countries achieve the nationally determined contributions and the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement to limit dangerous climate change. UK PACT seeks to be demand-driven, adjusting UK PACT key focus areas based on partner countries such as South Africa's needs and sectoral priorities. UK PACT intends to achieve this by working with partner countries to improve both capacity at local country level, as well as capability of key institutions in country to reduce emissions and to foster inclusive economic growth. UK PACT seeks to do this by addressing barriers and constraints to clean and green growth, as well as pursuing opportunities for greater climate ambition. In terms of country programs, UK PACT is currently active in China, Colombia, Malaysia, Mexico, and South Africa. UK PACT has a Green Recovery Challenge Fund, which supports innovative capacity building projects in a wide range of overseas development agency eligible countries, such as South Africa, to promote emissions reductions and low carbon solutions. And lastly, UK PACT also supports skills shares and secondments, which can be either short-term or long-term, supporting key institutions in the various countries in which UK PACT is active. In terms of this South Africa UK PACT program, it was launched last year in July and funded 10 projects with a total funding commitment by UK PACT to these South African-based projects of £3 million, roughly split into three focus areas, namely sustainable finance, in which this specific project fits, as well as sustainable transport and energy. And it enjoys the support and operational support from the British High Commission to South Africa. If you'd like to find out more information about UK PACT and South Africa UK PACT and this project in particular, please do follow those various links which have been provided. And I'd also like to just bring your attention to the DNA website in particular, which is hosting a lot of the outputs and deliverables from this particular project, which is UK PACT funded. In terms of the project itself, And just to give you a brief overview of this specific project, this project seeks to address barriers to both analysis and reporting of climate-related financial risks and opportunities, aligned to the TCFD Framework, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Our project team, which I'll introduce in the next slide, combines both domestic and international best practice expertise. For example, Vivid Economics has got various climate models, which are relied on extensively by both policymakers and investors around the world. And our local partners have got a deep understanding of South Africa's climate change policy and broader ESG landscape. The objective of this project is to speed up the use of detailed, useful, and timeous climate-related disclosures for investment decision makers in South Africa, with a specific focus on retirement fund trustees and other executives representing the retirement fund industry, as well as South Africa's asset management community. Again, this project, much like other UK PACT projects, is that it is intended to be a demand-led process. Effectively, the project will develop and create tools and resources that are easy to use and widely adopted, and that are also answering a need by financial sector stakeholders such as retirement funds and asset managers. And so what we'll be doing is supplementing and enhancing the impact of related initiatives within the country, some of which are also UK PACT funded, such as, for example, the NBI's various projects, and making sure that there is close alignment. Initially, this project is focusing on transition risk, and specifically how transition risk will and can impact on the listed equity universe of companies into which investors are investing, with a specific focus on the asset management and retirement fund industries. In future phases of this project, should we be successful in raising additional funding and support from UK PACT, the intention is to expand our current analysis from a physical risk perspective to other financial institutions as well as other asset classes beyond listed equities, and to develop fully South Africa-centric climate risk scenarios. However, as a prerequisite for seeking additional funding for an initial phase of this project, we are trying to address physical risk with respect to some of the research and deliverables under the specific leg of the project. Our project partners, without going into too much detail, DNA Economics is the project lead organization as part of the project consortium. DNA Economics has got a climate change practice area, which has for a long time been advising both government and the private sector in South Africa around climate change from both an economic and a policy perspective. The Greenhouse works alongside and in partnership with DNA Economics on a number of projects. The Greenhouse is a Cape Town-based sustainability consulting firm which advises a number of private sector clients in terms of their climate change strategies and plans. Vivid Economics is an international business with offices around the world. A lot of the climate models that are developed and used by leading investor organizations around the world rely on Vivid Economics models. And as such, this project team is really grateful to Vivid Economics for being part of the project team and making use of those models, which will be adjusted for the South African context as part of the resources that this project will be developing. WWF South Africa probably needs very little introduction to most of you. It is the South African chapter of one of the largest NGOs, which is conservation focused around the world, and WWF and Six Capitals are partnering on the capacity building and stakeholder engagement legs of this specific project, such as WWF and Six Capitals leading on these capacity building and information sharing webinars. Six Capitals Advisory is the business that Corley, Milani, and myself are active in. We are part of the Alternative Prosperity Group, and we work with both for-profit and non-profit organizations in helping them understand environmental, social, and governance risks as it relates to investment decision making and improved outcomes both for shareholders but also for other stakeholders. Moving on, just in terms of the project and how we are structured, the project has both a steering committee, which has Batseta, the Council for Retirement Funds for South Africa, the Investment Industry Association of South Africa, ASISA, as well as the Johannesburg Stock Exchange as the core members of our steering committee, which guides our project team in terms of the various deliverables of this project. Then we have a broad-based advisory group, and you can see on the right-hand side the various organizations which are represented as part of our advisory group. And effectively, we are producing literature and communications to a broad audience, webinars such as this one also to a broader audience. We have foundation level training coming up, and we'd like to draw your attention to that. If you are a retirement fund trustee or someone active in the retirement fund space, we'll be hosting 2 full-day online virtual workshops, which we'd love for you to join. And please do get in touch with us if you'd be interested in joining us for those 2 workshops. You can choose from one of the workshop dates. And then we'll also be hosting 4 half-day virtual workshops, which will be foundation level workshops, focusing on representatives from the asset management industry, such as portfolio managers and equity analysts, etc. And we'll be hosting these retirement fund focused workshops as well as asset manager focused workshops in September. So we will be sending out specific registration links to everyone who has joined us for one of these webinars so that you're aware of those webinars, those virtual workshops. We'll also be running best practice training and scenario training workshops, as well as a pilot workshop on some of the resources and tools that this project is developing. And we'll be sure to share more information about those opportunities in due course. So in a nutshell, this project, in terms of our work streams and outputs, very much focused on capacity building and awareness raising of climate risk and how it will particularly impact on listed equity companies in South Africa and its importance for investors. We have also done work around listed company disclosure analysis and reporting in order to build and to develop a reporting toolkit to assist both providers and users of climate risk-related data and information. And so things that you can look forward to are, for example, data request and disclosure templates and checklists, which may be beneficial to retirement funds, for example, in monitoring and assessing climate risk as it relates to their investment portfolios. We also want to highlight good practice examples. And so, we'll be kind of showcasing in terms of 2 reports that we've produced, as well as in some of the workshops around good examples of TCFD compliant or aligned climate-related financial disclosures and assisting South African investors and corporates in terms of thinking around how to best report in ways that are aligned to the TCFD framework. And so our outputs from this project will include both capacity building engagements such as today's webinar, reports, publications, as well as best practice workshops, which will be scheduled in due course. This slide just highlights some of the outputs which are available via the DNA Economics website. We have an Atleha-edu very foundational publication on climate-related financial disclosure, and we'd encourage you to have a read of that. We also have 2 reports available for download via the DNA Economics website. The first produced by Vivid Economics, looking at climate-related disclosures for financial institutions from a global perspective, and then more from a domestic perspective, DNA Economics, again looking at climate-related financial disclosure in South Africa. The two reports are complementary and they are intended to be read together, and we'd encourage you to have a read of those and to share them widely within your networks. Lastly, the 55 fact sheets that were developed by Six Capitals and WWF are also available on the large 55 JSE listed companies, looking at their alignment to TCFD reporting in terms of current ESG reporting as it relates to climate risk. I'm now going to invite Melanie and Cordley to present. And again, please do make sure to make use of our chat function in the meeting. We'd love to hear your questions and comments, and we do encourage interaction as far as possible. I'm just trying to stop sharing my screen. Really is an interesting Monday morning for the team here. It's not accepting my mouse click.
Adrian?
Melanie?
Maybe I can try and see if I start sharing things on my end.
Please do. Let's see if that will assist.
Let's try and see. So just for the purposes of the presenting on my end, I'm going to put off my camera because Adrian, your video feed on my end seemed to be a bit choppy this morning. So I'm just trying to see if that makes a change in terms of quality. But let's go over and try and share my second screen here. Great. It should be up. Adrian, can you just confirm that you are able to view my second screen fine on your end?
Melanie, it's Corley. I can see it.
Thank you very much, Corley.
But is it changing? Because if it's changing, then I'm still controlling it and it's not accepting my end.
Corley, can you still hear me on your end?
I can. Melanie, can you maybe try to advance the slide? It looks like you are sharing. So
okay, let's just test that. It seems Adrian might have a bit of technical issues. Can you see the second slide that I just flipped through? Okay. All right. Well, it seems as if this is working. Adrian, so I'm not sure it seems on Corley's side it's reflecting. So thank you very much for joining us this morning and the introductions, Adrian. Before I dive into today's session, I'd quickly like to just take a step back to run through some of the key concepts around climate risk opportunities and then its potential financial impacts on companies. Just maybe as a refresher for those who have attended previous sessions, but I think also just as a reminder for ourselves going into the responsibilities of directors and boards of companies, to keep that kind of in the back of our minds when Corley goes through the governance and management sections, and how this will impact how climate risk is managed and governed. So the TCFD framework have bucketed the two main categories of climate risk into two kind of buckets, which is referred to physical and transition risk. And I think it's just worth noting here that these risks relate relates inwards to companies. So in other words, the impact that these type of risks have on the organization rather than the outward impacts of the entity that it has in itself. So let's start off with the more easier and probably aptly named of the risk, which is physical risk. We can define it as risk that has a by its physical impact has impact on the environment that we operate in, and as a result then also impact on the financial performance of entities currently and going forward. And increased physical risk is driven by increased concentration of GHG emissions in the atmosphere that in theme 2 was well covered by WWF's section on the introduction to climate change. This we've learned results in increased average global surface temperatures, with some areas warming more than others and some even becoming cooler. So global warming in turn leads to increase in extreme weather events such as droughts, floods, and hurricanes becoming more intense and happening more often, and being much more difficult to predict in terms of their occurrence. And resultantly, the physical risks presents itself through damage to property, infrastructure, livelihoods, and the loss of lives, unfortunately, in some cases, which is caused by these short-term extreme weather events, and then also longer-term changes in climate and weather patterns. So, as I've just briefly mentioned in theme 1 session on climate change, which the WWF team presented on, South Africa is particularly highly vulnerable to climate change, as South Africa warms at roughly double the global average, and climate change is also expected to impact South Africa through, amongst other things, through increased temperatures, and then situations we've experienced in the recent past, like reduced water availability and reduced agriculture yields, as well as shifts in growth or increases in the severity of non-communicable diseases and increased air pollution and all that type of events and occurrences that was covered well in theme 1. And on the other hand, we have transition risk, which can be described as risks that arise due to changes through matters like regulation changes, policies, technology, and so forth. And this, I think, one can probably just shortly summarize as almost the fallout or the results from transitioning to a low carbon economy, as governments implement different policies and regulations in order to reduce GHG emissions. This will lead to a transition to low carbon models, and if financial institutions do not account for this transition in decision making and planning, they are at risk for in the near future for seeing increases in reduced returns and having to deal with increasing amounts of stranded assets and the likes. So with that in mind, let's just unpack these two types of risks a bit more, as they may both have varying levels of risk, posed varying levels of risk to different organizations. So the physical risks that are referred to that result from climate change can be event-driven. In other words, either acute or long-term shifts which is also referred to as chronic in climate patterns. And physical risks may have financial implications for organizations, such as direct damage to assets or indirect impacts from supply chain disruptions and so forth. Organizations' financial performances may also be affected by changes in water availability, sourcing, quality, food security, and extreme temperature changes that can affect an organization's premises, operations, supply chain, transport needs, and employee safety, amongst some, just mentioning a few here. So yeah, I think in short, just the acute risks plays out through extreme weather events, and then the chronic risks will play itself out almost over a longer term shift in climate patterns that is, I think, probably a bit more difficult to take or account for in strategic planning and so forth. So just in terms of the transition risks that I touched on in my introductory slide, transitioning to a low carbon economy may entail extensive policy, legal, technology, and market changes in order to address mitigation and adaptation requirements related to climate change. And depending on the need, the nature, speed, and the focus of these changes, transition risks may pose varying levels of financial as well as reputational risks to organizations. So, like I mentioned just now, there's a host of different type of risks that form part of this transitioning process, and the risks that go together with that. Some of that includes policy and legal risks. Policy actions around climate change is an evolving process and generally fall into two categories, namely policy actions which attempt to constrain actions that contribute to the adverse effects of climate change, or policy actions that seek to promote adaptation to climate change. And some of these examples include the likes of implementing carbon pricing mechanisms to reduce GHG emissions, adopting energy efficiency solutions, and encouraging greater water efficiency measures. The risks associated with and the financial impact of policy changes depend on the nature and timing of these policy changes. And then the other risk that goes together with that is litigation or legal risks. So in recent years, we've seen an increasing amount of global cases where climate-related litigation claims have been brought before courts by property owners, municipalities, different states, insurers, and shareholders, or even public interest organizations. Reasons for such litigation include failure of organizations to mitigate impacts of climate change, failure to adapt to climate change, and the inefficiency of disclosure around material financial risks of organizations. And as the value and losses of damage arising from climate change grows, one is certain to see litigation risk cases or litigation around matters relating to climate risk increase in the near future. We also have a technology risk, and related to that, technological improvements or innovations that support the transition to low carbon and energy efficient economic systems can have a significant impact on organizations. For example, the development and use of energy efficiency and carbon capture and storage will affect the competitiveness of certain organizations, their products and distribution costs, and ultimately demand for their products and services from end users. And to the extent that new technology displaces old systems and disrupts some parts of the existing economic system, that will mean that there are winners and losers that will emerge then from this this creative destruction process, almost, if you want to call it that. Then will also be, there's a addition to that, also market risk, and that relates to the supply and demand of certain commodities and products and services as it relates to climate-related risks and opportunity that are being increasingly taken into account by different consumer groups, which then ultimately, links to the reputation risk of organizations. And climate change has been identified as a potential source of reputational risk tied to changing consumer or community perceptions of an organization's contribution to the transition to a low carbon economy. So with all big transitions, there are naturally upsides and downsides, and together with all of these risks that I've highlighted now, there naturally also comes along a set of climate-related opportunities that various organizations can see to address in their business strategies and the like. So efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change also produce opportunities for organizations through, for example, increased resource efficiency and cost savings, and the adoption of low emission energy sources, and then the development of new products and services, as well as accessing or the ability to access new markets and building resilience along their supply chain. And climate-related opportunities will obviously vary then depending on the region in which organizations operate, as well as the market and then the industries in which these organizations operate. So I think just in summary, the TCFD's document around the recommendations summarizes it quite nicely, how these different risks and opportunities impact on an organization's financial position, and better disclosure of the financial impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities. They've set out as depicted in this image here. And in order to make more informed financial decisions, investors and lenders, as well as insurance underwriters, need to be able to understand how climate-related risks and opportunities are likely to impact an organization's future from a financial position as reflected in its income, cash flow statement and balance sheet, as outlined here in this image. But I'm not going to, at this stage, unpack it too heavily in order to kind of keep the level of conversation around the material impacts of climate risk around organizations, and to be able to go into that discussion with Corley's section around how that then affects director duties and how one as a company will govern climate risk. So that being said, we'll now go over into Corley's section. Corley will take us through the director's duty relating to climate change. Corley, I'll manage the slides on my end. Please just cue when you want to go forward or backwards.
Thanks a lot. Yes, thanks so much for giving us that background. I think before I kick off, I'm going to ask Sefako to launch our first polling question, just to kind of set the scene for moving into the conversation around governance. So if you look at that first question, it's the very basic question: do you believe that boards of companies are obligated to identify and manage climate risk in the same manner as any other strategic risk? So this is really just to test your perception in terms of whether you believe boards should be looking at this or not. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds just to answer that, and then I can see the responses are coming in, and it looks like most of them are saying yes to this question. So it might seem an obvious question in terms of the obligations of boards. So Farka, are you able to share the results for everyone to see on the screen? I'm not sure how it works on Teams, if I'm honest.
No, so everybody will see it as they respond.
Okay, let me see. Okay, so I see there are a couple of responses saying they're not sure, but most of the responses are saying a resounding yes. And I think this is good, because that already kind of sets the scene for an understanding that this is an important question. And what Melani's introduction has demonstrated to us, is just the extent of the risks that we're looking at here. But if we had to delve a little bit deeper then into the role of the board or the governing body, if you're not with a specific company or a listed company, the governing body of the entity is also referred to in King 4. These directors are fiduciaries of the entity, and they have to discharge their functions on a number of areas. So they oversee performance, they have to set strategic direction in terms of strategy, managing risk, ensuring compliance systems are in place. And it's well established that the board has ultimate accountability for these matters, even though they may delegate the responsibility for implementation and execution of management and strategic functions. So King 4 refers to the triple context within which companies operate in terms of the environment, society, as well as the economy. And this is further unpacked also in the context of integrated thinking into the 6 capitals that contribute to the creation, preservation, or erosion of value by an organization. So given that these elements, however, are inextricably intertwined, the considerations of risk and opportunity relating to any of these that may impact significantly on the organization need to form part and parcel of the governance function and the obligations of the governing body to look at these. So climate change, it's now accepted and well demonstrated that it poses an existential risk to humanity, to the planet, and to the global economy. I think Melanie has also alluded to that quite extensively already. But this is also now prompting, since we haven't seen enough urgency in the action, we're now seeing governments and businesses alike starting to take serious action and trying to accelerate the transition as well as the management of the physical risks. If you consider the Paris Agreement, delivering on the commitments made in the Paris Agreement already will require a wholesale shift in how companies are governed and how they look at the strategic positioning of the organization and their response to climate. And as they sit at the heart of corporate strategy in the direction of the company, climate needs to be incorporated here. But to come back to the question, directors have particular duties, and in the South African context and as encoded in the Companies Act, these encapsulate fiduciary duties as well as the duty of care, skill and diligence. There are also a range of common law duties that directors can be held to account for. So they're required to exercise proper judgment, reasonable care, skill and diligence in making decisions about how they govern the board and how they govern the organization. So as a matter of good governance and prudent risk management, the matters that they look at will evolve over time and as the company executes its strategy. However, climate change is becoming so deeply embedded that the strategic risk that it poses is something that now needs to almost be on every board meeting agenda. And failing to identify and assess and deal with the material climate risks that are posed to the organization could be seen as a failure of corporate governance. Unfortunately, what we've seen is despite this growing awareness, boards have limited knowledge. This is the perception. Let's get your view on that. So Fark, if you launch the second polling question for us, do you believe that boards of South African companies have the necessary knowledge and understanding in order to manage this risk appropriately? Okay, I see some responses coming in. I haven't seen anybody saying yes at this stage. Most people are saying no, while some people are not sure. Oh, there is a yes, that is a very advanced company, I'm sure. Great. So it looks like you also agree, for the most part, that there is a need for boards to have greater knowledge and understanding of climate risk to be able to manage it appropriately. But there is help, and I think that one of the reasons that this webinar is useful is to share with you some of the guidance and some of the developments in this space that are there to help companies. So, Melanie, I think you can move to the next slide, please. Just as a baseline, since the TCFD recommendations form the core of this webinar series, you can see already in the TCFD recommendations the importance of governance as a founding consideration to inform the response to climate risk is demonstrated by the fact that governance is one of the 4 pillars of the TCFD recommendations. And since the TCFD recommendations are currently the closest framework that we have to a mandatory requirement around the globe on climate disclosure, it serves purpose to well that you actually use this as a starting point to understand what it is that you need to do if your organization is still grappling with how to tackle it from a governance perspective. So the TCFD framework has set out 2 key recommendations from a governance perspective. This includes describing the board's oversight of the risks and opportunities and describing management's role in assessing and managing the risks and opportunities. If we had to delve into these very quickly in terms of exactly what the TCFD suggests organizations should consider, including in their disclosure, you can look, for example, from the board's perspective and oversight. You would look to see a description of processes that are followed and the frequency by which the board and or the relevant board committees are informed about climate-related issues, whether they then consider these issues when they review and develop strategy, key risk management policies, financial aspects such as budgets, business plans and other performance objectives, and then finally how they monitor and oversee progress. When you then look at the oversight from a management perspective, on the next slide, you're looking here for whether the organization is assigned climate-related responsibilities to management level positions. So is there a clear delegation to ensure that the direction that is set from the board is being implemented through management, and how they then report back to the board or a board committee. A description of the organizational structure and the processes of the issues and the communication also at management level and how it is monitored. So you can see that these are not rocket science aspects. It's the same kind of aspects that you would want to see when you are managing any material risk to the organization. And also this is reflected in King 4. But before we get to that, the implication for South African directors is that boards that are well counseled and well considering climate risk would make sure that they place climate risk on the board agenda and that they oversee the risk identification and ensure clear delegation to management. That is kind of a starting point. But if we unpack that a little bit more into more practical aspects, There are two key developments that are helpful in this regard. The first is a very fresh guidance document from the King Committee. It was released just this past Friday. It is available from the IIED's website, and it's an overview of the relevant principles from the King Code, which, as you know, applies to any type of entity that strives for best practice governance. So whether you're a listed company or a public entity, you can use the principles of King. And this guidance tries to contextualize the principles of King 4 relative to climate. But they highlight 7 particular themes that you need to consider, and then relates the various practices from and principles from King to each of these themes. So starting at the top there in terms of leadership, it reinforces the principles from King that the board are to act in good faith and in the best interest of the organization. And as stated by the IIED in 2018 already, these are not only statutory duties of the board directors, but this is also the realization that climate and the risks that climate pose to the organization requires to be considered if you are acting in the best interests of the organization. And in taking leadership, what other elements are relevant here is that at board level, you need an appropriate balance of knowledge, skills, expertise, and diversity. And this also means that if you want to consider relevant issues such as climate at your board level, you need to bring in knowledge into the board to enable you to exercise your leadership. Strategy, risk, and opportunity then, the direction is set by the board. And so climate risk assessments should also be considered across the entire universe of the business. So to which areas of the business do climate pose a risk or an opportunity, and how does that speak to the strategy of the organization? Management and accountability systems we've referred to. This is where you delegate to management to exercise or to implement and ensure that there are approaches and policies and processes in place to enable the directors to exercise oversight over management, because you can delegate responsibility, but you cannot abdicate the board accountability for taking responsibility for these issues. An issue that is a little bit more technical, perhaps, particularly in the climate context, is around the internalization of externalities and the need to start internalizing the external impacts of climate into the organization as well. And this really speaks to how the company sets its purpose. Many of you who are active in the sustainability environment would have seen the shift of companies, particularly in post-COVID times, around refocusing on the purpose of the organization. And this guidance really encourages organizations to refocus their purpose on the broader economy and society and the value that it can create for those. From a holistic perspective, to the value that you can put back into the environment where you operate versus what you extract, and just rebalancing the organization. So there are key King principles that link to that as well, and the guidance reinforces that, so that organizations can aim to achieve a net positive impact on society and the economy. Going around clockwise, reporting and disclosure, which is what the TCFD recommendations encourage. You would here use this guidance to help also then achieve better and more extensive disclosure on how the company is dealing with climate, but also from a governance perspective. Trust is enhanced if the organization can demonstrate that the issue is considered significant enough to be dealt with from a leadership and strategic level already. Assurance, principles around assurance and ensuring that what you disclose can contribute to the reporting being consistent and reliable is another consideration. And then finally, given, as Melanie had already alluded to, the kind of compliance and legal risks that may arise from a lack of dealing with climate issues. There are also guidance principles in King to deal with this that could be applied within the climate context. I think as an overarching perspective, the important thing to note is that the board of the organization sets the tone from the top for an ethical culture. And also if they can then demonstrate from the top that climate is considered to be a significant issue, that will filter down through the organization and management can be more effective. The second aspect of guidance that I'd like to bring up here is in terms of the practical recommendations that have been developed from the World Economic Forum. These to a certain extent dovetail very well with the guidance from the King Committee, although they have been in place a little bit longer. But if you are wondering how to go about setting up a climate governance system at board level, this guidance document, How to Set Up Effective Climate Governance on Corporate Boards, is very useful to set principles. Firstly, upskilling the board on climate risk and opportunities. Just to reinforce what I've already said, the need to ensure that the board composition is sufficiently diverse in knowledge, skills, and experience. And again, this is already an awareness that is there, particularly in regard to aspects such as gender diversity and racial diversity, but also in terms of skills. This is becoming a far more critical aspect over time. Boards should be composed of directors who collectively have a sufficient awareness and understanding of various aspects, but also in the ways particularly that climate change will be affecting the business, because the sufficient awareness will then set that tone at the top to filter through the organization. This will then enable you to prioritize climate risk at board level, because that accountability to stakeholders and particularly to shareholders will also mean that the board is being engaged more frequently by these stakeholders and shareholders around your response, and demonstrating that it is a priority will enable you to make sure that it's considered not only in your strategy, but also in your disclosure and stakeholder management. Board structure. The board should consider what the best way is to structure the board to ensure climate resilience, and also the implementation of embedding the various approaches. So at this point, I'd like to pause and ask for another polling question. Sefako, I think if we can skip to the polling question number 5, which says which approach is preferable, just again to test your sense in terms of what board structure is ideal in your view. So do you think that one should have a focused subcommittee for sustainability issues incorporating climate? Or should you integrate sustainability considerations across subcommittees, including for aspects such as risk and audit? Or should you take a combined approach? Very interesting feedback here, but the majority leaning towards a combination of both, which is both a focused subcommittee as well as an integrated approach. Quite a large percentage looking at an integrated approach as well. I think this is hugely positive and encouraging that this is the sense that people have, because I think, you know, this realization that integrated thinking is critical to ensure effective companies and effective boards is so important. And from a climate perspective, I think the integrated approach, and whether you have a focused subcommittee alongside with that, is certainly, in my mind, what I would recommend, because if you have that integrated thinking across risk, even in audit in terms of the financial aspects particularly, and oversight of reporting and disclosure, it certainly cannot cannot be overemphasized. Looking then at the other practical recommendations from this World Economic Forum guidance, risk and opportunity assessment, the board should ensure that they manage the materiality of climate risks, both across the short, the medium, and the long term, and that they ensure that the actions and the responses to climate are proportionate to the materiality, of course. So in the normal way that you would manage risk, rather than making it kind of a separate issue, the same kind of rigor should be applied to assessing materiality of climate to the organization, as well as the appropriate mitigation and response actions. Then in terms of strategic and organizational integration, the board should ensure that climate systematically informs the planning across the organization, and the decision-making processes are embedded into strategic implementation, development and review of strategy, management of risk, etc. A sticking issue and a very hotly emerging one is around incentivization. How does the board look at the incentives that executives are given in terms of aligning them with the long-term prosperity of the companies? Increasingly, investors are looking at how ESG aspects are being incorporated into executive remuneration, for example. And this is another thing for a board to consider. And you can consider what may work best for your organization in terms of your existing approach to incentivization and remuneration. Reporting and disclosure, very, very important basis and basic foundation as an outcome and an end product of the processes of integration and setting of strategy and ensuring that the right structures are in place. But we're not only talking here about what you report, but also your disclosure and interaction with stakeholders around the management of the issue, particularly to investors, and the TCFD recommendations are very well positioned to provide you with guidance on this. And this links to exchange, which speaks about your exchanges and dialogues with peers, with other stakeholders, to not only encourage the integration of climate as a material issue, but also to help each other to build capacity, sharing methodologies, staying informed about risks and regulatory requirements and the like. So these principles that are in the guidance from WEF as well as from the King Committee can really be used to facilitate discussion, and we should enable further conversations amongst ourselves in terms of how to ensure that climate becomes an issue that is commonplace in terms of discussions at boards, to enable companies then to disclose. Before I move into some examples of how companies are already dealing with it and already disclosing, let's look at the last two polling questions. So far, those would be questions 3 and 4 on my list. The first one is to ask whether your board does currently exercise oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities with specific focus. Wonderful to see so many yeses. Some not sure. I think where one is not sure, that is another critical recommendation for any governing body and leadership to ensure, that communication throughout the organization also demonstrates how the company is dealing with the issue. Some others still not yet doing it at board level. Great. So I hope that these recommendations are helpful for those that are not yet sure or who are still to start, and others that are doing it, that that you may be able to kind of expand what the board is doing. And then the last poll on this is where, and this is probably for those, mostly for those whose organizations are already dealing with it, do they aim to integrate it into board skills, or are companies mainly still relying on outsourced expertise to help advise the board and to help inform the board? Great, so responses across the board there. It's mostly at this stage looks like a combination of upskilling the board and outsourcing. I think this is probably inevitable because it is a technical, an issue that has very technical aspects to it. If you start, for example, working with science-based targets and the like, but wonderful also to see that there is a real effort to upskill boards as well. Great, thank you for that. So in closing from my side, I wanted to give you just two quick examples. Many companies are already in their integrated annual reports demonstrating how they are dealing with climate from a governance level. So you can see on the left-hand side that is an extract from SASOL's integrated annual report, and particularly the role of their board subcommittee for safety, social and ethics matters. And this board committee, part of their role is a quarterly review of sustainability issues and management. They were also responsible for developing an emission reduction roadmap to support the targets. And they also review the climate change and sustainability report. So you can see their very hands-on involvement from a board committee on specific climate-related issues from SASOL. I think what we're also seeing, and we haven't really delved into the management in terms of setting of targets and so on, that will follow in due course as companies integrate strategies into their businesses driven from the board level. But what is also useful to see here on the right-hand side, those two blocks from redefined properties, reflecting the expertise and the diversity of the expertise of the board, particularly with reference to environmental sustainability and climate change, as one of the key aspects that they integrate into their board expertise. And at the moment, they have 30% of their board members who have expertise in environmental sustainability and climate change. So it's useful to see how companies are already reporting on this from an integrated reporting perspective and the very top levels of their boards. I'm going to hand back now to Melanie. Adrienne, I don't know, I'll have a look in the meantime to see if there are any questions, but I'm going to hand back to Melanie to delve into some further examples of how companies are disclosing their governance approach in specific climate reports. Thank you, Melanie.
Thanks, Corley, for that great, insightful presentation on board responsibility as it relates to climate risk and managing that. Yeah, and also sharing that example around the integrated reports and how we're seeing that coming into play in terms of how companies are reporting on that, as well as some of the recommendations you've made. Just before I head into some more examples around how climate governance is disclosed by some local companies, Adrienne, are there any questions at this stage that you think is important to flag before heading into some of these examples?
Hi, Mel. We're monitoring the Q&A. There haven't been any questions that have been posted yet, so I think you can proceed. Thank you.
Okay, great. So before going into these examples, I think there are many great examples locally of companies doing a great job of disclosing their climate governance practices. These are just a few examples that we were able to kind of draw on. But yeah, like I'm saying, there's quite a number of companies we're starting to see either have dedicated TCFD reports, standalone reports, or already have reports such as the SASOL one that Corley just presented on, that is aligned to TCFD, but not necessarily standalone report. So the one that I'm showing to you guys now is a APSA one of their recent TCFD disclosure reports that they've released recently, and that sets out just very nicely how the board has oversight in terms of climate risk, as well as the frequency with which they receive that oversight, and then also just how they also then include risk into their strategic decision-making process. You'll also see that they've, at the end of last year, made climate risk one of their principal risk types, and that then is subsequently has been integrated into their enterprise risk management framework. So just in terms of processes, they've also then delegated responsibility of oversight to some of their board committees, and that also towards the bottom here indicates just in brief what these board committees are responsible for in terms of oversight, and how many times the interaction on climate risk is communicated to the board. You'll also see they provided a nice diagram here towards the end or the bottom of the slide, which shows us the lines of reporting between management and board level committees, and then they've also set out how management then communicates to the board on these types of risks. I think what is nice to see here is, and this is, it seems to be standard or increasing standard practice amongst global companies, is the practice of assigning accountability to a particular individual that has oversight of climate risk and opportunities within the organizations, that basically then is held accountable at the end of the day for oversight of these risks and opportunities. Okay. Let's quickly just move over. The following example, I'm going to kind of jump as I explain this between this slide as well as the diagram. The slide got a bit too full with all of my cues here for you guys, so I'll jump in between these two. But this is an extract from a Nedbank TCFD standalone report, which they very beautifully illustrate the different reporting lines as well as the flow of information that starts at the bottom here with the different business units, and then they have a separate climate task team, which then towards the end of the day feeds up into the different risk committee or the different board committees, excuse me. I think what is great here to see, which I'm not at the moment, or I haven't specifically seen, is the fact that they mention here that climate risks and opportunities, because it spans different entities, or it affects different entities within your business, it's also expected from their board committees to have oversight, or the different board committees that they have to have oversight over climate related matters, given that it affects such a, or has the potential to affect such a large array of matters across the business. Yeah, and I think here they very nicely also just set out again what the board's or the responsibility as it relates to oversight is, and then what the different functions are of the different board committees that are then responsible to report to the board on climate risk. And in terms of management, how they gave a nice and thorough kind of detailed explanation as to how management then reports to your board at the end of the day. So If I can move on then to another extract here, it's compiled also from a different few slides, so I'll kind of jump in between these as I go about it. But this again just sets out how the likes of Investec has set up their governance frameworks to oversee climate risk. And you'll see there that they also mention that this is their highest level of governance at a board level that takes responsibility for overseeing climate-related risks and opportunities. And then they set out here at the bottom that they do have a specific board-appointed committee that then oversees 3 times a year, or they meet 3 times a year to be able to kind of track progress on how climate risk and opportunity is affecting their business, and to be able to provide feedback to the board on progress on that front. Just below that section in the report, you'll also see they mention who the various directors are that are responsible or that makes up that board committee, and then they'll also provide the number of times or the times during the year that the board committee meets, as well as providing a thorough overview over what their different functions are, what are the specific areas that this board monitors and reports to them at the end of the day. So this is one of the points Corley mentioned before she ended off her set of recommendations, which is, I think, also something that's becoming best practice, it seems, from a global perspective. And we have some local companies that are also kind of paving the way in setting this tone, in connecting performance at a management and a board or exco level to ESG performance, oftentimes within that banner of ESG, but some closely link it to climate related matters. And here you'll see that they have set short-term and long-term incentives that relate to broader ESG targets that's been set at a exco level. Yeah, and I think just to kind of quickly summarize it more on the management section, you'll also note here towards the left-hand side of the slide that Investec has also taken the route of assigning particular accountability to their CEO that oversees climate risks and opportunities. So that means at the end of the day, when questions are being asked around this particular issue, that would be seen as the individual that has ultimate accountability then for that. And yeah, so I think this slide then just generally nicely sums up how Investec has decided to delegate some of these responsibilities on a management level, and also summarizes what these functions are and what they are responsible for in their different roles that make up management. So yeah, then we're heading towards the end of our section. Adrian is just going to do the closing for us, but before he does the formal closing, there's some resources that Adrian would like to share with you guys, which is particularly helpful from a governance perspective in managing climate risk. Adrian, should I continue to share on my side? Have you resolved your?
Thanks, Mel. Let's just, if you can just move to the next slide, please. And I think if you can just keep on sharing.
Okay, no problem.
Let's do that approach. Thank you so much, Corley and Melanie, for your respective presentations. I'm sure there will be a few questions coming through from our attendees. But we did want to just highlight for everyone a number of the resources which have been used to develop the content that Melanie and Corley have presented on today. Some of which is very, very recent. For example, the IOD King Committee guidance paper, which was only published last week. And so very much hot off the press, and links to these various resources have been provided in the chat function, but will also be included in the webinar presentations, which will be loaded to the project resource area of the DNA Economics website. So we'd encourage you to have a look at that website and to make use of these resources. So we still have a few minutes left before our 12 o'clock webinar end time. Corley posed the question if anybody would like to share their own experience from a board level or from a company perspective around how your board is managing climate risk from a governance and management perspective. We'd love to hear from you. So I'm not sure if there are any questions. Please would you either enter your question into the meeting chat if you'd like to pose a question to Corley or Melanie, or feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you so that you can make a verbal comment or add a verbal question. So I'll give you a few seconds to respond if there's any specific questions or comments or sharing experience that you'd like to contribute. Please would you do so now? Okay, I'm not seeing any raised hands or any specific questions or volunteers to share experience. What we'll then do is we have a number of gender equity and social inclusion questions as our closing polling questions that I'd like to ask Safaku to bring up. UK PACT has a very strong focus on gender equity and social inclusion. And so as a result, in all of our webinars, we're just asking for views on GESI questions. So Safaku, if I can ask you to load the first of those GESI polls, please. So the question is, do you feel gender and social inclusion concerns are being considered in the context of climate-related financial disclosures in South Africa? Yes, no, or not sure. We'd appreciate your response to that question. So we've got 20 responses so far. The overwhelming majority, close to, well, 2/3 saying no. Currently, gender equity and social inclusion concerns are not sufficiently considered in the context of climate-related financial disclosures. Thank you, Safaku. I think we can end that poll and move on to the next one. Right, the next question is, what priority gender equity and social inclusion, or GESI, issues and concerns would you like to see featured in an analysis and reporting toolkit? So the project team is working on a toolkit as part of our GESI focus area for this project. Would you like to see gender equality, equity, social inclusion included in the toolkit recommendations, or are you not sure? Please take a minute to respond to that question. Okay, we have 16 responses with the overwhelming majority just short of 2/3 focusing on, or the response being, social inclusion, followed by equity, and then gender equality and not sure, the two other responses with lower response rates. Okay, we can close this poll and load the next one, please.
Adrian, those are the only two.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much, Safaku. Then if I can just ask that we load the post-webinar feedback form in the chat function, please. For our funders, UK PACT, each of our webinars, we are required to ask you as webinar attendees to let us have your feedback. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar. There is still an opportunity for some Q&A and discussion but I'm not seeing any questions coming through. Apologies again for having to move meeting platforms. This is the 5th of 8 webinars in this series, and it's the first time we've had that technical challenge. So we are confident we'll be able to address it and fix it in time for our next webinar on this same theme, which is taking place on Wednesday this week from 12 o'clock until 2 o'clock. Please do join us if you missed some of the content from today's webinar. Otherwise, to mention that we will be uploading the webinar recording from today's webinar, as well as the presentation slides on the DNA website. Please do also get in touch if you would like to claim your 2 Batseta CPD hours or credits. If you're a retirement fund trustee or principal officer, we're able to offer Batseta members Batseta CPD credits for having joined today's webinar. We have posted links to the asset manager and retirement fund focused virtual workshops, which will be covering some of this content, but going into a bit more detail and also allowing for more interactive Q&A and audience participation. We have 4 half-day asset manager focused workshops coming up in September, and we have 2 full-day interactive online sessions planned for retirement funds. Please, if you qualify as an asset manager or someone that has a responsibility for investment decision-making and actioning those decisions, please do feel free to join us for the asset manager sessions. If you are a retirement fund trustee or principal officer or an asset consultant advising retirement funds, then we'd invite you to register and attend our 2 full-day virtual workshops intended for a retirement fund audience. With that, I think it only remains for me to thank Melanie and Corley for their respective presentations today. Thank you to Safaku for helping us with behind-the-scenes support. We trust that you've benefited from joining us today. Please do take 2 minutes to respond to that post-webinar survey. We'd really appreciate that. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in this webinar series. Thank you so much for your time today and have a great week. Enjoy the day further. Bye-bye.